Alright everybody, the day has finally arrived. Today, we are finally going to be talking about Rebel Moon Part 1, the Director's Cut, also known as Chalice of Blood. I'm gonna tell you, this felt like an entirely different movie than the one I watched December of 2023. The stakes felt different, they felt way higher, the film had different messages that were way better executed, the action was gorier, there was way more character development, especially for Jimmy, as well as Sam and Ares, which I was very happy to see. Additionally, we also got to further see Cora's backstory as well as other characters like General Titus, Nemesis. We got to see their backstories way more fleshed out. If you want to see how I score this film based on 5 stars at the end of this video, then I'll give you the timestamp right now to skip ahead and go check it out for yourself. Now let's get into the spoilery changes with this film, which I have 4 pages of notes right here while I was first watching the film that I picked up on initially. So let me get into some of the changes now that I thought could have been done a little bit better. First of all, we learn in this version that the farm on Velt is where they pride themselves upon having sex in order to grow their crops. It's sort of religious thing, which, you know, definitely fits into the weirdness of the sci-fi genre, although the sex scene that follows between Cora and the other guy, yeah, I thought that kind of dragged on a little too long, but then again, you know, I wasn't so crazy about the sex stuff with Oppenheimer, but even then, they got it over with quicker, and it was better paced then, so there's that. There was also the slow motion stuff. Thankfully, though, it's pulled back for a lot of the scenes that were added back into this film. It definitely wasn't as distracting as Part 2. When I get to watching and reviewing Part 2, possibly tomorrow, I'm hoping that Snyder didn't go overboard with the slow motion stuff he used here. Unlike the first part of Rebel Moon, there's essentially no title cards. That's another change that I'm not too crazy about, especially given that this is supposed to be the definitive version. It kind of relies on the viewer having to have watched the theatrical version first before to know what these planets are called, so I think that could have been done a little better. So that's it for the drawbacks I have for the changes. Now let's get on to the good stuff. First of all, the entire first opening 20 minutes of the entire movie, it's entirely different. Like Jimmy's monologue in the beginning of the theatrical cut, that's entirely gone. Instead, we get an entirely different scene of the planet where Ares is living on being attacked, and the mother world is after the rebels there. We focus on this one family where, as the mother world's killing the innocent civilians and stripping down the women and branding them with their hot markers similar to Batman v Superman, we see that, and we see this family that's being chased after by Atticus Noble. So Admiral Noble, he lands on a ship, and we get a dialogue scene between him and another corporal, which is a homage to the opening of Return of the Jedi. And then we focus on Ares' family, where they're cornered by Admiral Noble, and then it gives the oldest son of the father the bone cane, in which he uses to crush in the skulls of his victim, and he wants Ares for his mother world army, and so he tells him to, before he does, he's struggling with it and his family's protesting. But then there's the moment of symbolism which I really hope is going to be expanded upon. Before Ares does bash his father's head in, his father looks at him and says that he forgives him, just like the princess did in that flashback scene at Part 2. After that scene, you know, they take Ares in to be one of their own soldiers, and Noble goes to finish off the remainder of the family, where the mother calls him out for having no honor at all, and Admiral Noble says she's right. Before she kills the family, he swings the staff right into her head as the film's title card opens up, and it cuts straight to the planet Velt. But before we get into the next changes story-wise, let's talk about the different color grade. Not only does it look more desaturated, but there's also, you know, a more greenish tint to the overall film. It's definitely a move on the studio to have him put back some of the saturation for his film versus the militant-like color grade that he envisioned for his director's cut. So there's that, and there's also much more sexual profanity in the Harvest Master's speech, where he drops a lot of F-bombs. A lot of F-bombs. I also thought that could have been done much more subtly. I mean, I'm fine with a couple, but the way it's done here, I've kind of felt uncomfortable with it. And after that, everything runs pretty much the same, except we get an extra bit with the farming community where they're getting grain sacks prepared before the dreadnought arrives and Admiral Noble goes in to investigate. And then when it comes to the father of the village's death, it's much more brutal. When Noble first bashes his head in with the skull, he stands stands there for a moment before collapsing to the ground, and then he just whacks him over and over again. And when one of the farm maidens rushes over to his side when she's slashed up by the blue saber, there's a lot more blood, a lot more gore, which definitely signifies what you're going to be in for compared to the theatrical cut. And from there, pretty much everything that I haven't already mentioned, except for the extra gore with them saving Sam and Ares, everything runs the same until we get to extended young Korra's flashback scene, where we see more of the violence that happened at her world, where there were no negotiations, no terms, they just came in, dominated it. And we also get a new flashback to the power core of the ship, where it's explained that the ship powers off organic material, aka the dead bodies of the planets they invaded. That's why they dominate planets at times without consenting to any negotiations or terms, because they need to keep the ship running, and so they have to kill people to do it. And it explains the chalice symbolism at the end of the flashback, where Korra says that she was found at peace when she saw the chalice holder in that painting against the war and terror that had been going on around her in the mother world that she'd been adopted into. We also get our very first new scene with Jimmy, where we see more of his backstory told through his monologues, with him taking off the scarecrow cloak from a nearby scarecrow within the farmer fields and putting it on for himself. And then from there on, we get to the bar scene in this film's equivalent of the Mos Eisley spaceport, except it's in western style buildings and it's pouring rain. And from there, apart from extra gore with the action, nothing really changes that I haven't already talked about, except towards the end, where there's extra world building with that sexualized bounty hunter, as well as a certain species that watches Kai's ship take off with Korra and Gunner on them. Pay attention, because that species, I don't know the name, but that species is going to come up again much later within the film. And then after that, we get an extra 5 to 7 minutes with the townsfolk, Sam and Ares included, where they're pulling the ship that Korra arrived in out of the wreckage. And after they do that with the rope successfully, Ares tries to fix the ship but is having no luck. Sam tries to reassure him, but Ares is still very concerned because he knows how dangerous and how powerful the mother world is. And then that night, Ares realizes that Jimmy did the fixing for the ship when he sees that the lights are on and that the guns are up. So that was definitely a good scene that they added in that much better explains how that ship is fully operational in part 2 when Korra uses it. There's also an extra shot of the bird flying away with a bit of the Dragon Keeper's leg in one of its claws, which I thought was a pretty nice touch to the comedy that was being played there. That subtle messaging that if you treat people and or animals lesser than yourself, then you're never going to get very far in life. So from there on, we go to the Cobalt mine planet, Dagus, where we get a new introduction to Nemesis, where instead of being introduced to the planet through establishing shots, we cut to them having a bite outside one of the bars, and we get introduced to Nemesis, who's also there, and she offers their assistance to them before they go down the elevator. And then from there, we get the big action scene, which not only has a lot more gore and blood, but there's also of when the Lady Spider's arachnid is slashed wide open from under, literally hundreds of little baby spiders fall out of it and go crawling all over the place. Definitely not something that was in the theatrical version. Then there's a new scene, the one that I most remembered from the trailer and was most disappointed that they didn't keep in for the director's cut, with once Jimmy gets one of those red fireflies in his blue sight, the firefly then begins to glow blue, and in turn, waves upon waves of all those fireflies around that one firefly also glow from red to blue. That was a beautiful shot that perfectly symbolizes the ripples of change, of rebellion that's already going on around the tiny moon of Vel. And that was definitely a scene that should have been kept in for the theatrical version. From cinematography to soundtrack to Jimmy's voice actor, that was a great moment, and I'm glad that it finally made its way into the director's cut. After some extended dialogue between Korra and the king, we get another harvest scene with Jimmy and the villagers, where Sam and Ares notice that the cloak that Jimmy took was the same one that was used to dress up one of their scarecrows. And then after that, we go to the Coliseum planet, where we get a lot more gore. Remember before when we see a guy getting dragged out into theatrical, yet his whole body is still there? Well, we don't get that anymore, since only his legs and the bottom of his torso is still there, whereas the upper half of his body is nothing but a bloody, bony mess. Ooh, yeah. And we also get extended dialogue between Korra and Titus. We get to see more of Titus berating the small band of rebels for forcing him to rinse off from all the dirt that he's accumulated. And then we also get the extended Night Sky coward scene. And then after that, pretty much everything else runs the same as it did, except we get, and the one significant change I forgot to mention in this film was the tooth painting, where Admiral Noble collects teeth of those he executes with his cane and then puts them around the painting of the princess that was killed, one by one, from Aerie's father to the father of the village in Velt to the guy I'm talking about now. He does that. Not only do we get to see that, but also the scene where they're blowing up that planet with the dreadnought cannons. It's way extended. We get to see more of the process of them firing up their weapons than we did before. We also get to see what I believe to be a better paced scene where we get to see the dreadnought along with the other ships break course from the planet and pursue the small band of rebels. We get the extra force scene back at Velt where we see Jimmy sitting next to a dead deer carcass, namely its skull with mushrooms growing out one of the eye holes. So he takes the antlers of that dead skull, puts it on his head, therefore completed a circle that was otherwise left almost entirely on the cutting room floor for the theatrical version. After that, we get a couple new establishing shots of Gondival. From there, we also get an extra bit with the species who had helped Kai make the setup. The very same species that I mentioned was spying on Kai's ship earlier, where she holds out one of the laser swords that the Nemesis had, and there's an explanation of how they glow. And from there, the scene plays out pretty much the same way it did in the theatrical cut, except first of all, there's way more blood than there was in the original, and also, during the final one-on-one between Korra and Noble, there's actually the addition of Atticus getting stabbed through the arm where Korra had snapped one end of the cane off, as well as through the leg and chest stab she made through. There's extra blood there, and most importantly, when she goes for the final swing at Noble's head, we see the teeth being knocked off Noble's mouth before he falls into what Korra thinks to be his watery grave. And then, in the next scene where we see him resurrected, you can see that he definitely has the missing teeth this time, as opposed to the theatrical cut where all his teeth are still intact, which I thought was pretty weird when I first watched the theatrical cut, so I assumed that Korra had only hit Noble's back molars, and that's why his front teeth still look intact. But now that it looks like his teeth are missing, because they are, it definitely makes a lot more sense. But we get an extra scene of them getting back to the spaceport on Velt, getting the horses back, and then we see more of the same species as the one that I just discussed, the very same one that spied on Kai's ship before he took off on that same spaceport, the same one that helped Kai set up the trap for the rebels. Not only that, but as we get to see the horses finally heading back home, we get definitely an alternate shot of Jimmy overlooking the village and the horses from the wheat fields. And instead of fading back to Gondival as it does in the theatrical, we see one last time that same species spy on them, that same species take note of them heading back to their village before they walk off, presumably to report it to the mother world. And then we get back to the final scene of this film, where Noble is taken back up to the dreadnought and is resurrected. And when he does come face to face with Korra's father, the scene's actually way longer than it is in the theatrical, where it goes more in depth of not only the revelation that it was Korra who had killed the princess, but also that Korra was Noble's boss's daughter. And we get one more change. The medical people there who are trying to bring Noble back to life say, hit him harder, before saying, hit him with everything, instead of the theatrical where they only say hit him with everything. Then Noble's resurrected, it cuts to black, and for the last change we don't see the end part 1 title card that plays right after. So that pretty much covers it for all the changes that I could find so far to Rebel Moon, the director's cut versus the theatrical version I saw last year. As for a rating for this film, I'm torn between 4.5 and 5 stars. I definitely want to watch this film again so that I can further solidify a new rating, but for now, I'm gonna give this film the same score as I did the theatrical cut, 4.5 out of 5 stars, plus a quarter of a star for telling a better story. If you find any more changes, please feel free to let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this review that I gave Rebel Moon, please feel free to drop a like and consider subscribing so that you don't miss out on when I next do Rebel Moon Part 2, the director's cut, also known as the Curse of Forgiveness. So yeah, with that in mind, thanks for watching, and please stay tuned for when I do the next review here on this channel. So long for now.